Hey folks, and welcome back to the least knowledgeable sim racing channel. Once upon a time, the inclusion of a sport, pursuit, or a form of athleticism into the World Olympics would have been its highest honor. It was validation on the world stage that that pursuit was finally worthy of being put out in front of the entire world. As the world has globalized over the last 20 years, the pizzazz of the Olympics has perhaps dropped off a little bit in that time. As a result, the inclusion of sim racing into the Olympic Games, which once upon a time may have been a front-page news high-ticket item, is now, well, perhaps predictably another source of division for us sim racers. In this slightly different conversational style video, we'll be going over what the International Olympic Committee actually plan and whether or not Gran Turismo itself is an ideal ambassador for sim racing on the world stage. Before we move on, however, if you're a long-time viewer and you haven't hit that subscribe button yet, that would help me out immensely and get the video out to way more people, so please do that, and let's move on. We'll begin by reading one of the main articles about the topic here at CNET. So, Gran Turismo sim racing is now an Olympic sport. Remember when your mum said you'd go nowhere playing video games? Yeah, who's laughing now? That's kind of been the case for almost 20 years now, so we're a little bit behind the curve there. Esports has exploded as one of the most legitimate forms of athleticism, if you want to call it, out in the world, and it's something that kids are taking up by the bucket load. So, who would have thought nights in front of the TV screen and a PlayStation could one day lead someone to becoming an Olympian? The goal is now achievable after the International Olympic Committee announced Thursday a new virtual Olympic series. Among the various virtual sports added, motorsport made the cut with the Gran Turismo and FIA partnership. So it's very important to note, this is a PlayStation exclusive and it's a Gran Turismo exclusive. This is something that we're going to circle back around to and chat about after I read through this article. Specific details on the Olympic Gran Turismo series aren't available yet, but the committee said each virtual sport will follow the sport's respective publisher platform. The series may end up a lot like other FIA-sanctioned Gran Turismo sim racing leagues. The events will take place starting May 13th and run through June 23rd ahead of the 2021 Tokyo Olympics, so it's a preamble event, it's not part of the main Olympic events. Essentially, this series will hype the Olympic Games, basically an opener, while reaching out to a younger audience, IOC President Thomas Bach said. That's very interesting because, as I mentioned at the start of this video, the Olympics have been rapidly losing their viewership over the last several iterations, and they need ways to pull people in the modern world back into it because the world really isn't what it was back in the 90s, 80s and before. The goal is to get as many people involved as possible, with each sport responsible for creating the virtual Olympic stage for the games to be held. That shouldn't be too hard, noting esports has exploded in popularity in recent years, as we just said. Aside from the motorsport and the FIA Gran Turismo partnership, the committee announced the World Baseball Softball Confederation, Union Cycliste Internationale, World Rowing and World Sailing organizations will also each participate in the Digital Olympic Games. Very interesting lineup that sim racing is a part of there. So, with that in mind, it's not really a fully legitimate event just yet. It's more of a hype kind of preamble event leading into the main Olympics. It's interesting that the Olympics don't take it seriously enough to include it as part of the main events. But let's quickly talk about what this actually means. Very recently, Emily Jones kind of broke the sim racing scene with her tweet acknowledging the division in the sim racing scene. So, news that once upon a time should have been vastly positive and accepted across the board as a universal benefit for all sim racers was instead taken on board more with people taking issues with Gran Turismo being the ambassador of sim racing. So, we can talk about this from a few different perspectives. I want to start off talking about it as, I suppose, a sim racer first and a business owner second, because they're two very different things, and the logistical reality of the world is very different to what you may want it to be as a fan of something. So, beginning with Gran Turismo itself, it's fair to say that out of the vast collection of sims that we have access to these days, from Assetto Corsa Competizione to R-Factor 2, iRacing, Race Room Race Experience, etc., there are vastly more, let's say, realistic options available to be ambassadors for sim racing than Gran Turismo or Gran Turismo Sport, whatever it is that they're going to use. I'm going to guess it's Sport because 7 isn't ready yet. When it comes to organizing an event that's as logistically complex as the Olympic Games, there are so many moving parts and so many things involved that beyond the pure quality and expression of what you're featuring, what matters more is the reliability and the ability to satisfy those logistic needs. Polyphony Digital, with the backing of Sony, with a partnership with the FIA, all the licenses are ready to go. There are no additional legal complications, and you're not really dealing with the smallest sim racing team around. So these people have the weight behind them in order to make things happen, in order to provide what needs to be provided in the time frame that needs to be provided in. When you take a smaller developer team, even such as Kunos, or especially if you take someone like Studio 397, not only can you guarantee the reliability of the product on the world stage, which would be hugely embarrassing if something falls apart, like many of the many rFactor 2 netcode and reliability issues that we've had over the years in multiplayer events. That's a complete disaster for an event such as the Olympics. So to them, they're happy to essentially slash the pretense that it's aspiring to be realistic and simply treat it as a pursuit unto itself. I guess this was more treating it as a business owner rather than a sim racer. Obviously, as a sim racer, this is more of a hardcore focused channel. So odds are, if you're here, you're a fan of something like Assetto Corsa Competizione, rFactor 2, AMS2, or something along that line that essentially tries to emulate the sensation of real driving in the virtual realm. Now, that's one thing. But when you take it to being an Olympic event, you can completely dispense with that. And let's say that in time they begin to feature something like League of Legends. League of Legends has no pretense to being realistic in any way, shape, or form, and even though the mechanics in it are contrived, those contrived mechanics create their own framework within which one can be skilled or not skilled depending on the rule set of the world that they've created. Gran Turismo Sport is much the same. Even though the people racing within it on the Olympic stage may not immediately be able to transition to being top-class GT drivers or Formula drivers, they are in fact the best in the world at their particular pursuit, being good at Gran Turismo Sport. And that unto itself is what the Olympics are looking to represent. It isn't necessarily the idea that, hey, we've got virtual motorsport here that's replicating real-life driving. It's, no, we have virtual motorsport, and that is in and of itself the end. That is what they're trying to be good at. That is what they're trying to achieve their skill set at. So if you manage to delineate those two in your mind, the real-life motorsport world and the sim racing world and just a racing world, then what they've done here with Gran Turismo makes a lot more sense, because first of all, the logistics can be met, the licenses are all there, the game looks very good, it's very reliable, and it runs on one particular console. It's made for that one particular console that's very accessible and attainable for a vast array of people, rather than the more finicky PC-based sims. It's worth noting that some of these institutions like the Olympics are extremely political by design, and no doubt there are tons of deals happening behind the scenes to ensure that the highest capital players are the ones that are going to get the face time of their products. That's just a reality of the world, unfortunately, and it's not always the highest tier product that ends up in front of people, but just the one that's been marketed and executed the best way to appeal to the widest amount of people. Now, as hardcore sim racers, would we prefer to see something like ACC representing our niche hobby on the world stage? Of course we would, and you could even argue that Kunos, if given enough lead-in knowledge, could probably make the game potentially airtight and streamlined and optimized enough for whatever systems in the Olympics were going to run it. That being said, it just doesn't have the same draw, doesn't have the same amount of licenses, and just doesn't have the same amount of weight of capital behind it as something like Gran Turismo. So I think instead of throwing out the baby with the bathwater, as it were, in this case, we can probably just take a small win and say that, hey, look, any extra attention to sim racing on the world stage is probably a good thing. You can see Gran Turismo Sport as a bit of a gateway entry into the wider world of esports and sim racing as a whole. If it gets featured on the Olympics and a huge number of kids are exposed to it who otherwise may not have been, that can be the gateway that they need to pick up a G29, start racing in GT Sport, realize that they want something a little bit more. Maybe they'll hear about ACC or rFactor or Race Room or iRacing or whatever in passing, and then go, wow, there's a whole deeper world out here that can train me for real life motorsport, and then you have your next generation of sim racers. So I'd like to take this more as a positive rather than a negative. I don't think we're ever going to go swinging out of the gate and essentially get rFactor 2 featured in the Olympics as the ultimate realization of sim racing. Obviously, the more niche the game, the smaller the development team, the harder it is for them to satisfy the logistical needs of an organization like the Olympic Committee. So it'd be good if we could just take a step back and say, hey, this is a small win for all of us as sim racers. Let's just enjoy it for the time being, and moreover, let's just see how it's presented and how it comes off and how it's received by the wider world at large. Anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed the little diatribe. If you did, you want to stay up to date with future news about the Olympic Committee and Gran Turismo as it pertains to the Olympic events, make sure to click that subscribe button, and I'll see you guys in the next one.